Imagine sitting in enemy territory thousands of miles from home when suddenly the people who captured you start singing to you on Christmas Eve, and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever heard. In December 1944, deep in the Welsh countryside near Bridgend, hundreds of German sailors who'd spent months hunting Allied ships in U-boats found themselves locked behind barbed wire at Island Farm, staring at another cold night in captivity. These weren't just any prisoners. They were Kriegsmarine, the elite naval force that had terrorized the Atlantic for years. And Christmas was coming, which made everything worse. But nobody, not the guards, not the locals, and definitely not these hardened sailors, expected what was about to happen. The camp itself was brutal in its simplicity. Row after row of wooden huts. Freezing Welsh wind cutting through the gaps, guards watching from towers. These men had been pulled from sinking submarines, dragged from the ocean after their vessels were destroyed. Some had watched their crewmates drown. Now they spent their days working on nearby farms under constant watch, living with the bitter knowledge that Germany was losing and they might never see home again. And that's the thing about being a prisoner of war. It's not just about being locked up. When you're captured, you lose more than freedom. You lose your identity. One day you're a warrior fighting for your country, the next you're just another number in a foreign camp. For these U-boat crews, it was even harder. They'd been part of something feared and respected, the wolf packs that nearly brought Britain to its knees. Now they were scrubbing floors and digging ditches in Wales. The psychological shift alone was crushing. And as Christmas approached, every single one of them felt it. That hollow ache of being completely forgotten. Which is why what happened on Christmas Eve hit them so hard, because when those voices started rising over the camp fences, something broke inside these men. And we need to talk about why. But first, you need to understand what life was actually like in these camps. Island Farm wasn't some Hollywood prison with dramatic escapes happening every week. It was mind-numbingly boring most of the time, punctuated by moments of deep psychological pain. The prisoners woke up at dawn, ate watery porridge, worked whatever jobs the British assigned them, then returned to their barracks to sit and think about everything they'd lost. Day after day after day, the monotony was its own kind of torture. These were men who'd lived on adrenaline for years, navigating U-boats through enemy waters, launching torpedoes, diving to avoid depth charges. The constant threat of death had become normal for them. And now they stacked hay bales, they repaired fences, they moved rocks from one pile to another pile. The British weren't cruel about it, they followed the Geneva Conventions, but the purposelessness of it ate at these men in ways that physical hardship never could. And here's what most people don't understand about U-boat crews specifically. These weren't conscripts who got unlucky. U-boat service was volunteer only because it was so dangerous. The men who served on submarines were true believers, the best of the best in German naval training. They'd been told they were the tip of the spear, that they were going to starve Britain into submission and win the war for the fatherland. They believed it too, at least at first. But by late 1944, everyone knew the truth. Germany was collapsing. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were pushing from the east. The wolf packs that had once dominated the Atlantic were being hunted down and destroyed by improved Allied tactics. For these prisoners in Wales, the reality was inescapable. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd risked their lives for, was falling apart, and they were stuck behind barbed wire, unable to do anything about it. That kind of helplessness does things to people. Some of the prisoners withdrew completely, barely speaking for weeks at a time. Others became obsessive about routine, making their bunks with military precision, polishing their boots even though there was nowhere to go. A few tried to maintain discipline, organizing the other prisoners into work details and study groups, but it was hard to maintain any sense of purpose when the whole world knew you were on the losing side. The guards saw it happening. British soldiers who'd been assigned to watch these prisoners started to notice the change as winter set in. The Germans stopped singing the songs they used to sing in the barracks. They stopped the card games and the storytelling sessions. They just sat there, staring at the walls or out the windows at the Welsh hills in the distance, thinking about God knows what. And then December arrived and everything got worse. As December 24th approached, the prisoners knew exactly what day it was. Many of them were devout Lutherans. Christmas wasn't just a holiday, it was sacred. They had photos tucked under their bunks, faded pictures of wives and children they hadn't seen in years. Some wrote letters home that would never arrive. Others just sat in silence, staring at nothing, because talking about it made it worse. But here's what made it unbearable. The guards noticed it. The prisoners stopped their usual card games, stopped the quiet conversations in German that filled the barracks most nights. Instead, there was this heavy silence. broken only by someone occasionally humming a hymn, then stopping himself as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. One guard later wrote in his diary that it felt like the entire camp was holding its breath, waiting for a day that would remind them of everything they'd lost. The thing about Christmas in German culture, especially for that generation, was how deeply it was woven into family life. It wasn't just about presents or decorations. It was about gathering around the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, singing O Tannenbaum and Stille Nacht, attending midnight mass, coming home to a warm house filled with the smell of baking. For these men, Christmas meant home in a way that nothing else did, and they were thousands of miles away from any of it. Some of the prisoners tried to create their own small traditions. A few of them carved little wooden figures from scraps they'd collected on work details, crude nativity scenes, Christmas trees, anything that connected them to what they'd lost. Others organized a small service in one of the barracks, reading Bible passages in German by candlelight. But it all felt hollow. Every attempt to celebrate just reminded them of where they weren't, who they weren't with. And that's when the locals decided to do something that nobody saw coming. See, the Welsh communities around Bridgen had every reason to hate these men. Their own sons and husbands were fighting overseas. Some had been killed by German forces. These U-boat crews had sunk British ships, killed Allied sailors. The women working in the factories nearby had lost brothers and fathers to the war. The farmers whose fields these prisoners worked had seen their harvests requisitioned for the war effort, while their own families went without. Nobody would have blamed them for wanting these Germans to suffer, but the Welsh are different. They have this deep tradition of music and faith that runs through everything they do. Their church choirs are legendary, going back centuries. Welsh culture has always held on to this idea that music isn't just entertainment. It's a form of prayer, a way of expressing things that words can't touch. And on Christmas Eve, a group of them decided that even enemies deserve to hear the sacred music of the season. It wasn't a unanimous decision. Some people in Bridgen thought it was a betrayal, singing for the same men who'd been trying to kill British sailors just months earlier. There were heated discussions in church meetings, arguments in pubs, families divided over whether this was Christian compassion or dangerous naivety. But the people who organised it, mostly from the local Methodist and Baptist churches, believed deeply that Christmas meant something. That if their faith was real, it had to extend even to people they had every reason to hate. So they gathered. Choir members from 3 different churches, about 40 people in total. They bundled up against the cold Welsh winter, brought their sheet music and made their way to Island Farm as darkness fell on Christmas Eve. The guards were confused at first. Nobody had told them this was happening, but the choir had gotten permission from the camp commandant, who figured it couldn't hurt and might actually calm things down. Which brings us to the moment that changed everything for these prisoners. Because what happened next wasn't just singing, it was something that tore down walls these men didn't even know they'd built. As evening fell, the prisoners heard something strange. Movement outside the fences. People gathering. At first they thought it might be protesters or angry locals. The war had created enough hatred that violence against prisoners wasn't unheard of. Even in Britain, some of the Germans moved away from the windows, instinctively seeking cover. Others watched nervously, trying to figure out what was happening. Then the sound began. Rich, powerful voices rising in harmony, Welsh hymns filling the cold December air. The prisoners froze. Some stood up from their bunks, others moved toward the windows, pressing against the glass to see where it was coming from. The first song was in Welsh, a traditional carol that none of the Germans recognized, but they didn't need to understand the words. The sound itself was overwhelming. Welsh choral singing has this quality that's hard to describe if you've never heard it in person. It's not just about hitting the right notes, it's about this deep emotional resonance, voices blending in a way that feels almost otherworldly. The prisoners stood transfixed, listening to people they'd been fighting against pour their hearts into sacred music. But here's what broke them. The choir sang Silent Night, first in Welsh, then in German. These hardened naval officers, men who'd faced death in the crushing depths of the Atlantic, started crying. Openly. One U-boat captain later described it as the moment when he remembered he was still human. The guards watched in stunned silence as prisoner after prisoner wiped tears from their faces, some mouthing the words, others just standing there shaking. The Welsh voices were so pure, so completely free of hatred or judgment, that it cut through everything. Think about what that moment meant. These men had spent months, some of them years, building emotional armor. You don't survive in a U-boat without learning to shut off your feelings. The fear, the claustrophobia, the knowledge that depth charges could crush your vessel at any moment. You deal with all of that by becoming hard, by focusing on the mission, by not letting yourself feel too much. And imprisonment had required another layer of emotional protection, another wall between themselves and the reality of their situation. And then 40 Welsh villagers showed up and demolished all of it with one song. The prisoners who'd been holding themselves together through sheer force of will suddenly couldn't anymore. Men who hadn't cried since childhood found tears streaming down their faces. Some of them had to sit down, overcome by the weight of everything they'd been carrying. Others gripped the window frames so hard their knuckles turned white, trying to maintain some kind of control while their entire emotional defense system crumbled. And that's the thing about music in wartime. It does something words can't. When you're at war, you build these mental walls to survive. You turn the enemy into something less than human, because if you see them as people like you, the whole thing becomes impossible. How do you launch a torpedo at a ship if you're thinking about the sailors on board having families and dreams and hopes just like yours? You can't, so you don't think about it. You think about them as targets, as the enemy, as obstacles between you and victory. But music, especially sacred music, it bypasses all of that. It reaches something deeper. For these German sailors, hearing Silent Night in their own language, sung by the people they'd been fighting against, it shattered every defensive barrier they'd constructed. It reminded them that the Welsh singers had families too, that everyone was suffering, that underneath all the uniforms and flags they shared the same longings. One prisoner later wrote about that night in his memoir. He described standing at the window of his barracks, watching his breath fog the glass, listening to these voices sing the same song his mother used to sing to him as a child. He said it was like being torn in half. Part of him was still a loyal German officer who'd fought bravely for his country, but another part was just a scared, lonely man who wanted to go home and be with the people he loved. And the music forced him to acknowledge both parts at once, to hold that tension without being able to resolve it. That's what made it so powerful. The Welsh choir wasn't trying to make the prisoners feel guilty or to convert them to anything. They weren't making a political statement. They were simply offering beauty and grace in the middle of ugliness and suffering. And that simple act of giving without expecting anything in return, that's what destroyed these men emotionally, because it reminded them that such things were still possible, that the war hadn't corrupted everything, that somewhere underneath all the death and destruction, humanity was still intact. Which is why what happened next was even more powerful, because the prisoners did something that night that even the guards weren't prepared for. After the Welsh choir finished several songs, something unexpected happened. From inside the barracks, German voices began to rise, quietly at first, then stronger. They started singing their own hymns, their own Christmas carols. The Welsh choir heard it and kept going, and for several minutes both groups sang together, separated by barbed wire but joined by something bigger than the war. Guards later said it was the most surreal thing they'd ever witnessed. Picture it, the night was cold and clear, stars visible above the camp. Steam rose from the breath of 40 Welsh singers standing outside the fence. Inside the barracks, hundreds of German prisoners pressed against windows or stood in doorways, their voices carrying across the compound. For those few minutes, the war didn't exist. There were no enemies, no sides, no winners or losers. There was just music, faith, and a shared recognition of something sacred. The prisoners sang songs they'd learned as children, O Tannenbaum, and Es ist ein Ros entsprungen, and Vom Himmel hoch. Some of them hadn't sung these songs since before the war, back when they were just young men in Germany with normal lives and normal hopes. Singing them now, in this place, under these circumstances, it brought all of that back. Not just the memories, but the feeling of being that person, of believing the world was basically good and that the future held promise. But this is where it gets even more striking. One prisoner, interviewed years later, said that was the first night since his capture that he felt like a human being instead of an enemy. Another described how he'd been planning to escape, nursing his anger and hatred. But after that night, he couldn't hold on to it anymore. The Welsh choir didn't come with speeches or demands or attempts to convert anyone. They just came with their voices, their tradition, their decision that even in the darkest time of the war, some things were more important than division. Several of the guards wrote about that night in letters home or in diaries that survived the war. One British sergeant described watching a German officer, a man who'd been sullen and uncooperative for months, break down completely during Silent Night, then compose himself and begin singing along with the Welsh choir. The sergeant wrote that he'd never seen such a transformation, that it was like watching someone remember who they used to be before the war turned them into something else. Another guard described the eerie beauty of it, how the sound of hundreds of voices singing in two different languages created this strange harmony that echoed across the camp. He said it made him think about his own family back in England, about how they were probably singing the same songs that night, and how strange it was that something so simple as a Christmas carol could connect people across such vast distances and such profound divisions. And that choice, that simple act, it revealed something crucial about how we survive the worst of times. The thing about war is that it tries to convince everyone that the other side is monsters. Propaganda works because it's easier to fight someone you've dehumanized. The Germans had been told that the British were decadent, weak, trying to strangle Germany and keep it from its rightful place in the world. The British had been told that Germans were barbaric, that they'd started an unjust war, that they needed to be defeated at any cost. Both sides had good reasons to hate each other. Real deaths, real suffering, real atrocities that couldn't be denied. But these Welsh villagers refused to play that game. They looked at these prisoners and saw men away from their families at Christmas. They chose compassion over hatred, not because they were naive or didn't understand the stakes. They'd lost people too, but because they believed their faith and humanity demanded it. And in doing so, they gave those German sailors something they couldn't get anywhere else, a reason to believe in basic human decency again. That's the part that's easy to miss. The choir didn't just make the prisoners feel better for one night, they gave them back something essential that imprisonment and defeat had taken away. The belief that goodness still existed in the world. When everything around you is telling you that humanity has failed, that we're all just animals tearing each other apart, experiencing genuine kindness from people who have every reason to hate you, that changes something fundamental. One of the prisoners later described it like this. He said that after months of captivity, he'd started to believe that the whole world had gone insane, that the war had revealed something dark and true about human nature that couldn't be undone. He'd become cynical, bitter, convinced that all the talk about civilization and morality had been exposed as a lie. But that night, hearing those voices, watching those Welsh men and women stand in the cold to sing for their enemies, it cracked that cynicism. It forced him to acknowledge that maybe humanity wasn't completely broken after all, which is why this moment mattered so much more than anyone realized at the time. Because the effects of that night didn't end when the singing stopped. They rippled forward in ways nobody expected. After the war ended and these prisoners eventually returned to Germany, many of them never forgot that Christmas Eve in Wales. Some wrote letters to the choirs, trying to find the people who had sung for them. Others told their children and grandchildren about the night when their enemies gave them the gift of recognizing their shared humanity. It became one of those stories that gets passed down, not because it was dramatic or violent, but because it was true in a way that mattered more. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Germany was devastated. Cities were in ruins. Millions were dead. The full horror of the Holocaust was being revealed. For Germans trying to process what their country had done, trying to figure out how to move forward, stories like the Welsh choir became important. They offered proof that not everything about the war had been darkness, that moments of grace had existed even in the worst circumstances. One former prisoner became a schoolteacher in Hamburg after the war. He made it a tradition every Christmas to tell his students about that night in Wales. He wanted them to understand that even in war, even when countries are trying to destroy each other, individual people can choose something different. He wanted them to know that hatred isn't inevitable, that compassion is always possible, that faith in humanity can survive anything if people work to maintain it. But here's what makes this story even more important today. In the decades after the war, some of these former prisoners returned to Bridgend. They met with local families, attended memorial services, and participated in reconciliation efforts. The act of that choir singing on Christmas Eve 1944 created a bridge that lasted generations. One former U-boat officer brought his son to Wales in the 1980s, specifically to show him the camp where he'd been held, and to explain how that one night changed his understanding of what it meant to be enemies and what it meant to be human. These return visits weren't easy. Some of the Welsh families who'd lost people in the war struggled with the idea of welcoming back German sailors. There were still wounds, still anger, still grief that hadn't fully healed, but the memory of that choir singing on Christmas Eve gave them a framework for thinking about reconciliation. If their parents and grandparents had been able to extend grace to these men during the war, when the pain was raw and immediate, then surely they could continue that work now in peacetime. The camp itself is gone now. Island Farm was demolished decades ago, turned back into farmland, but there's a memorial there placed by a joint committee of British and German veterans. It mentions the escape attempts. Island Farm was actually the site of the largest prison break in Britain during the war, though that's another story. But it also mentions the choir, the Christmas Eve service that reminded everyone involved that beneath the uniforms and flags, they were all just people trying to survive something terrible. And that's the real lesson here, the one we need to hear right now. We live in a time where division feels permanent, where seeing the humanity in people we disagree with seems almost impossible. Our politics have become tribal. Our media reinforces our existing beliefs. Our social networks create echo chambers where we only hear from people who already think like us. It's easier than ever to turn the other side into monsters, to convince ourselves that they're not just wrong, but evil, that they don't deserve empathy or understanding. But this moment in 1944 proves something crucial. Even in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, ordinary people found ways to choose connection over hatred. The Welsh choir didn't excuse what those U-boat crews had done. They didn't pretend the war wasn't happening. They didn't say that both sides were equally right or that the moral questions were complicated. They just decided that on Christmas Eve, music and faith and basic human compassion mattered more than revenge. And that choice created something that lasted far longer than the war itself. Think about what that means for us today. We're not at war, not really. Nobody's dropping bombs on our cities. Nobody's being forced into prisoner of war camps. The divisions we face are serious, but they're not existential in the way that World War II was. And yet we seem less capable of extending grace to each other than those Welsh villagers were to enemy sailors who'd been trying to sink their ships. What changed? Maybe it's that we've lost touch with the idea that our enemies are still human. The Welsh singers understood something essential, that the German prisoners were both responsible for their actions and deserving of basic dignity. That you could oppose what someone had done while still recognizing their humanity. That hatred and compassion could coexist. That you could fight against someone's ideas or actions while still treating them as a person. We've lost that nuance. We want everything to be simple, everyone to be either good or evil, every situation to have a clear hero and villain. But life isn't like that. The German prisoners at Island Farm weren't innocent. They'd fought for Nazi Germany, they'd participated in a war that killed millions, but they were also scared young men far from home, suffering in ways that weren't justified just because they'd been on the wrong side. Both things could be true at once. The Welsh choir understood that. They didn't sing for those prisoners because they thought the Germans were right. They sang because they believed that human dignity doesn't depend on being right, that compassion isn't something you earn through good behaviour. It's something you extend because of your own values, your own beliefs about what it means to be human. That's a hard thing to hold on to. It's so much easier to divide the world into us and them, good and evil, people who deserve kindness and people who don't. But easy doesn't make it right, and the Welsh villagers chose the harder path, the one that required them to see past their own pain and anger to recognise something sacred in people they had every reason to hate. Which leaves us with one final question. What moments in our own lives, with our own enemies, are we missing because we've forgotten what those Welsh singers understood that cold December night? Think about the people you've written off, the family members you don't talk to anymore because of politics, the former friends you've cut out of your life because they said something you found unforgivable, the strangers online you've reduced to caricatures because they disagree with you about important issues. Are any of them actually evil, or have you just found it easier to see them that way than to acknowledge their complexity? The Welsh choir didn't have to sing for those prisoners. Nobody would have blamed them for staying home, for letting those Germans spend Christmas in misery. They chose to do something harder, something that required them to act against their own immediate interests and emotions. And that choice changed lives, created connections that lasted decades, gave hope to people who desperately needed it. What would it look like if we made similar choices? Not grand gestures or public displays, but small acts of recognition that the people we oppose are still people. A willingness to listen even when we disagree. An acknowledgement that someone can be wrong about important things and still deserve basic respect. A choice to extend grace even when, especially when, it's not earned or expected. That's what that Christmas Eve in 1944 teaches us. Not that we should paper over real differences or pretend that all positions are equally valid, but that our humanity doesn't depend on being right, and neither does anyone else's. that music and faith and compassion can create bridges even across the deepest divides, that choosing to see someone's humanity even when they're your enemy isn't weakness. It's the hardest and most important thing we can do. The German prisoners who heard that choir never forgot it. It changed how they understood the war, how they understood their enemies, how they understood themselves. It gave them something to hold on to in the darkest time of their lives, a memory of beauty and grace that sustained them through everything that came after. What if we could give that to someone? What if we could be the ones who choose compassion over hatred, who extend grace to people who don't deserve it, who create moments of connection that people remember for the rest of their lives? That's what those Welsh villagers did on Christmas Eve 1944. They didn't end the war. They didn't change the political situation or solve any of the big problems. They just sang. But for the men who heard them, it was everything. Share your family's war stories in the comments. Let's remember our shared humanity together.